When we talk about medieval knights, it is easy to picture stories of brave heroes. We think of shining armor and noble quests, but thinking about whether they fought fair is a bit tricky. Our idea of fair is not what it was for them. You see, the world was different then. Life was hard, war was brutal, and a knight's main job was to win. He had to survive. So, what did fair mean to a knight? It rarely meant an even match. It wasn't about shaking hands before a fight. It wasn't about rules that made things equal. Instead, it was more about honor. It was about reputation. And it was about following certain expectations for their social class. Knights were professional soldiers. They spent their lives training. They learned how to ride horses in heavy armor. They practiced with swords, lances, and axes. Their whole purpose was to be better than their enemy. They wanted an advantage. They wanted to crush the other side. This is not about being fair in a sporting sense. This is about victory. Chivalry was a big part of knightly culture. It was a code of conduct. It said knights should be brave, they should protect the weak, they should honor women. And they should be loyal to their lord. It also said they should fight with honor. But honor could be quite flexible. On the battlefield, honor often meant winning the battle for your lord. It meant not running away. It meant showing courage. It did not always mean giving the enemy an equal chance. Think about a tournament. These were mock battles. They had rules. Knights might use blunt weapons. They might score points. These events often tried to look like a fair contest, but even then, some knights cheated. They used sharper weapons. They ganged up on weaker opponents. Even in play, the drive to win was strong. Real war was another thing entirely. War meant killing, it meant destruction, it meant taking land or protecting it. In real war, anything that helped you win was often seen as acceptable. Ambushes were common. Traps were set, deception was a tool. These tactics are not what most people today would call fair, but they were effective, and effectiveness meant survival for the knight and his men. It meant success for his lord. Also, knights fought other knights differently than they fought common soldiers. A captured knight could be ransomed. He was valuable. Killing a knight unnecessarily might be seen as bad form. It could lead to problems later if you were captured, but common foot soldiers, they were often killed without much thought. They had no ransom value, they were just part of the enemy force. This tells us a lot. Fairness, if it existed, applied mostly within the knightly class. It was a kind of professional courtesy, not a universal rule of engagement. The idea of a one-on-one duel with strict rules was mostly for specific situations. These were called judicial duels. They were rare. They happened to settle a dispute. Or to prove guilt or innocence, these duels had very strict rules, but even then, the goal was not truly fairness. The goal was to let God decide the outcome. The stronger, or perhaps more righteous, fighter was expected to win. So, when we ask if medieval knights fought fair, we have to look at their world. We cannot use our modern ideas of fair play. They were not fighting a game, they were fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their land, they were fighting for their lords. And in that context, winning was everything. Any means to win, as long as it didn't completely ruin your reputation or break an explicit oath, was often on the table. Their definition of fair was deeply tied to their honor, their station, and the harsh realities of their violent age. It was a complex mix of ideals and brutal pragmatism. The ideals of chivalry often stood in stark contrast to the grim reality of medieval battle. The chivalry, at its heart, was a code. It laid out how a knight should behave. It stressed virtues like courage, loyalty, and courtesy. It also promoted the idea of protecting the innocent and upholding justice. This code came from a mix of influences. The church wanted to tame the warrior class. Courtly love stories painted knights as noble protectors. Society wanted some order in a chaotic world. So knights were meant to be more than just brutal fighters. They were supposed to be paragons of virtue. But then there was the battlefield. Here, the beautiful ideals of chivalry often got pushed aside. War is not polite. It is not pretty. It is about survival. It is about dominating the enemy, and it is about winning at almost any cost. A knight might swear an oath of loyalty. He might promise to fight honorably, but if trickery would save his men, or win the day for his lord, he would likely use it. His primary duty was to his lord and his cause. Think about the concept of honorable combat. For a knight, this often meant facing an enemy knight. It meant fighting with courage. It meant not running from a challenge, but it did not mean giving the enemy an advantage. It did not mean avoiding ambushes. It did not mean refusing to outnumber an enemy force. These were all standard military tactics. They were effective ways to win, and winning was honorable. Consider the role of ransom. A captured knight had value. He could be exchanged for money, land, or other prisoners. This created a strong incentive to take enemy knights alive rather than killing them. This was a practical arrangement. It benefited both sides in a way. If you were a knight, you might show mercy to an opponent. But this was less about fairness and more about financial gain. It was also about a kind of unspoken understanding among the knightly class. If you killed a captured knight, you risked the same fate if you were ever caught. However, this idea of mercy rarely extended to common soldiers. They had no ransom value. They were often viewed as expendable. So, a knight might fight another knight with a degree of restraint, hoping for ransom. But he would cut down foot soldiers without a second thought. This shows the class-based nature of chivalry and honor. It was a system that largely applied within the elite warrior class, and then there are the less savory aspects. Medieval warfare was often marked by atrocities, looting, burning villages, killing civilians. These were common. Knights, even those who claimed to be chivalrous, participated in these acts. They might justify it as part of war, or they might simply not care. The code of chivalry was often more about how knights treated each other, and sometimes how they treated high-ranking women, than about universal human rights. Fanned retreats were a classic tactic. An army would pretend to flee. This would draw the enemy out of formation. Then the fleeing army would turn and attack the disorganized pursuers. This is a clever tactic. Now, it is effective, but is it fair by our modern standards? Probably not. It involves deception. But in medieval war, deception was a valid tool. It was not seen as dishonorable if it led to victory. So, while the ideals of chivalry offered a beautiful vision of knightly conduct, the reality was often far grimmer. Knights were trained killers. They lived in a violent world. Their priority was to serve their lord and win battles. If that meant resorting to tactics that we might consider unfair, they would do it. The code of chivalry was a guideline. It was a noble aspiration, but necessity and pragmatism often dictated the actual actions of knights on the battlefield. The gap between the ideal and the real was often wide. The tools of war in the medieval period were not designed for fair fights. They were made for one purpose: to inflict damage, to kill, or to disable an enemy. Knights used a range of weapons. Swords, lances, axes, maces, and even daggers were all part of their arsenal. Each was deadly. A lance was used in a charge, often from horseback. It was meant to knock an enemy off their horse, or to pierce armor. It was a devastating weapon. Once the initial charge was over, knights would draw their swords. Swords were sharp, they were heavy, they could cut and thrust. They were good for close combat. An axe or a mace could smash through armor. They could break bones. These weapons did not care about a fair contest. They cared about ending the fight quickly and decisively. Armor was also a key part of this. Knights wore plate armor in later periods. Before that, chainmail was common. Armor offered protection. But it also made a knight a bigger, slower target. And armor had weak points, joints were less protected. Visors could be lifted. A clever opponent would aim for these spots. This is not about fighting fair. This is about finding the weakness and exploiting it. It is about survival. Tactics on the battlefield also show this focus on winning, not on fair play. Commanders did not line up their armies and say, let's all fight one-on-one. That would be absurd. They used strategy, they used formations, they tried to gain an advantage, ambushes were common, hiding troops, and then surprising an enemy force was a powerful way to win. It was unexpected. It caused panic. It gave the ambushing side a huge advantage. This is not fair in any sense we understand it. But it was a brilliant military move. It saved lives on the ambushing side, and it often secured victory. And flanking maneuvers were also standard. This meant attacking an enemy from the side, or even from the rear. If you could get around an enemy's main line, you could cause chaos. You could cut off their escape. You could destroy their formation. This tactic aims to make the fight as unfair as possible for the enemy. It is about gaining a decisive advantage. Fanned retreats were another example. An army would pretend to run away. This made the enemy think they were winning. The enemy would break ranks and chase. Then, the fleeing army would turn around. They would attack the now disorganized pursuers. This was a very effective trick. It used deception to win. It was a smart move in war. But it was not fair. The use of archers also changed things. Longbowmen or crossbowmen could rain down arrows from a distance. They could decimate enemy ranks before the knights even met in close combat. This is not a fair one-on-one fight. This is about using ranged weapons to weaken the enemy. It is about making the close combat easier for your own knights. combined arms were essential. Knights on horseback, foot soldiers, archers, they all worked together. A knight might lead a charge, but he relied on the archers to soften the enemy. He relied on the foot soldiers to hold the line. This combined effort was about overwhelming the enemy. It was about applying maximum force. It was not about ensuring an equal fight. Even psychological warfare played a part. Trumpets, drums, war cries, these were used to scare the enemy, to boost the morale of your own troops, to make the other side feel less confident. These things contribute to an advantage. They make the fight less fair for the enemy. They make them more likely to break and run. So, when you look at the weapons and tactics, it becomes clear. Medieval warfare was a brutal business. It was about winning, it was about survival. There was no concept of a fair fight in the modern sense. Were knights, and their commanders used every tool. They used every trick. They used every advantage they could get. They aimed to end the conflict swiftly and decisively. They did not aim for an even playing field. Their priority was victory, and in war, victory often means making things as unfair as possible for your opponent. The way knights interacted with each other on the battlefield was often different from how they treated common soldiers. This distinction is really important. It sheds light on what fairness might have meant, if anything, within their own social circle. If a knight faced another knight in battle, there was a different set of unwritten rules. This was because a captured knight had significant value. He could be ransomed. This meant his family or his lord would pay a sum of money or goods to get him back. This economic reality influenced how knights fought. Taking a knight alive was often more profitable than killing him. If you killed a knight, he got his armor and weapons, but if you captured him, you could get a huge sum of money. This incentive often led knights to try and subdue their opponents rather than just cutting them down. This could be seen as a form of mercy, but it was deeply rooted in pragmatism and personal gain. So, if a knight saw himself losing, he might surrender. He would yield his sword. He would offer to become a prisoner. This was a recognized part of the combat system. And killing a knight who had surrendered was generally frowned upon. It was seen as dishonorable. It could lead to retaliation if you yourself were ever captured. This unwritten rule was a form of protection. It was a way to survive defeat with your life intact, even if your freedom was lost for a time. However, this was not a hard and fast rule. In the heat of battle, a surrendered knight might still be killed. Or he might be killed if his captors didn't recognize his rank, or if they were simply too bloodthirsty. But generally, the expectation was that a noble would be taken prisoner. This system of ransom also meant that the rules of engagement often applied more to knights fighting other knights. They were part of the same elite class, they understood each other, they shared certain expectations. But this courtesy rarely extended to common foot soldiers. Common soldiers, who made up the bulk of most armies, had no ransom value. They were not from noble families, they did not have wealth to offer, so if they were defeated, they were often simply slaughtered. There was little incentive to take them alive. This highlights a huge class divide in medieval warfare. A knight might be spared, a peasant soldier almost certainly would not. This shows that any idea of fairness or rules was very much class-specific. Reputation also played a big part. A knight's reputation for bravery, skill, and honor was very important. A knight who routinely killed surrendered foes might gain a reputation as a brutal killer. This could make other knights less likely to show him mercy if he were ever captured. It could also make him less respected by his peers, so there was a social pressure to adhere to certain standards, at least when dealing with other knights. But this pressure had limits. The primary goal was still to win. If killing a surrendered knight was seen as necessary to ensure victory, or if it was done out of rage in the thick of combat, it might be overlooked. The context of war often overshadowed the ideals of chivalry. Consider the Crusades. Here, knights fought against people of a different faith. The rules of engagement often changed drastically. The idea of ransom for enemy knights was sometimes ignored. Massacres were more common. Religious fervor often overrode any pretense of knightly courtesy. This further shows that the rules were flexible. They depended on who the enemy was, they depended on the stakes. So, while there were certain expectations about how knights should treat each other, especially concerning ransom and surrender, these were not about fairness in a modern sense. They were practical agreements, they were about personal gain, they were about protecting one's own skin in the event of capture, and they were about maintaining a certain status within the knightly class. For everyone else on the battlefield, the rules were much simpler: survive or die. So, did medieval knights fight fair? When we look back at the whole picture, it is clear the answer is not a simple yes or no. It is a complex situation. Their idea of fairness was very different from ours. It was also highly contextual. Knights were warriors. Their training, their weapons, and their very purpose were all geared towards winning. They were not training for a sporting match with equal rules. They were training for war. And in war, the objective is to defeat your enemy. You use every advantage you can. This means ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and deception were all legitimate tools. They were not seen as unfair in a way that would bring shame. They were seen as effective. Chivalry was a powerful code. It told knights how they should behave. It spoke of courage, honor, and protecting the weak. But this code was often an ideal. It was something to strive for. The harsh realities of battle often pushed these ideals aside. Survival came first. Victory for one's lord came first. If that meant resorting to brutal tactics, then so be it. The gap between the noble aspirations of chivalry and the gritty practice of medieval warfare was often very wide. And the concept of fairness was often class-based. Knights fighting other knights might have certain expectations. A ransom was a big part of this. It meant a defeated knight could often save his life. This was a practical arrangement. It benefited both sides, but this unspoken code of conduct rarely extended to common soldiers. They had no ransom value. They were often killed without mercy. So any idea of fairness was selective. It applied mainly to the elite warrior class among themselves. Think about the distinction between a judicial duel and a battlefield. A judicial duel was a highly ritualized event. It had very strict rules. It was meant to settle a legal dispute. It was meant to let God determine the truth. This was perhaps the closest thing to a fair fight they had. But these duels were rare. They were for specific legal situations, not for general warfare. On the battlefield, chaos reigned. The goal was simply to crush the enemy. Ultimately, we have to understand the world they lived in. It was a brutal age, life was often short, violence was common. The idea that combat should be fair in the sense of an even contest is largely a modern concept. We project our own values onto the past. Medieval knights were not thinking about equal opportunities for their enemies. They were thinking about how to kill their enemies most efficiently. They were thinking about how to survive. They were thinking about how to win the battle and gain glory for themselves and their lord. So, no, medieval knights generally did not fight, fair by our modern understanding of the word. They fought to win. They fought effectively. They fought brutally. And within their own context, using every possible advantage was not just acceptable, it was expected. Their honor was tied to their bravery and their success, not to an artificial sense of equal combat. They were products of their time, and that time was a violent, pragmatic one where victory was the ultimate measure.